Emma Carter's tiny fingers trembled as they gripped Max's golden fur, digging deep into the soft coat like it was the only thing tethering her to earth. The 7-year-old hadn't spoken a single word in 2 years, not since that terrible night when the rain-slicked highway had stolen everything from her. Not since the screeching tires, the shattering glass, the smell of gasoline and copper. Not since her mother's voice, mid-song on the radio, had gone silent forever. Now, perched on a hard wooden bench in the cold hallway of Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, she faced another kind of nightmare. One that didn't involve twisted metal or flashing ambulance lights, but something equally terrifying: the possibility of losing the only family she had left. The courthouse smelled wrong, like floor polish and old paper, and the nervous sweat of 100 different people fighting 100 different battles. Emma pressed closer to Max, the 80-pound golden retriever who'd become her voice, her protector, her lifeline. His vest read, "Psychiatric Service Dog Do Not Pet," in bold red letters, but that didn't stop strangers from staring. "She's so young to be in court," a woman whispered to her companion as they passed. "Poor thing." Emma's grandmother, Dorothy Carter, squeezed her shoulder gently. "Don't listen to them, sweetheart. We're going to be just fine." But her grandmother's voice shook when she said it, betraying the fear that Emma could feel radiating from her like heat from a stove. Dorothy was 68 years old. With silver hair, she'd stopped dying after her daughter, Emma's mother, had died. The past 2 years had carved new lines into her face, deep grooves of grief and worry and sleepless nights. Lawyers in expensive suits rushed past them, their shoes clicking importantly on the marble floors. They carried leather briefcases and talked in low, urgent voices about cases and precedents and outcomes. None of them looked at Emma. To them, she was just another case number, another file to be processed. But to one man waiting down the hall, she was a ticket to something else entirely. Robert Carter leaned against the opposite wall, checking his phone with studied casualness. He'd gotten a haircut yesterday, bought a new suit from Macy's with his last paycheck from the warehouse. His sponsor from AA had helped him pick out the tie, navy blue, conservative, trustworthy. Everything about his appearance screamed reformed man and responsible father. Emma had seen him once before, during a supervised visit 3 weeks ago. She'd hidden behind Dorothy's legs the entire time, refusing to acknowledge him even when he'd tried to give her a stuffed bear. Max had growled, actually growled, which he'd never done before. The social worker had written something on her clipboard, frowning. Now Robert glanced in their direction and Emma felt her chest tighten. She couldn't explain it, didn't have the words even if she could speak, but something about him felt dangerous. Not in the obvious way, not like the drunk driver who'd killed her mother, but in a quieter, more insidious way. Like thin ice that looked solid until you stepped on it. Max sensed her distress immediately. He stood, positioning himself between Emma and Robert's line of sight, and did a movement they'd practiced in therapy. He pressed his full weight against her legs, grounding her, reminding her that she was safe, that he was there. "Good boy," Dorothy murmured, stroking Max's ears. "Such a good boy." The door to Courtroom 3C opened and a bailiff stepped out. "Carter custody hearing. All parties please enter." Emma's stomach dropped. This was it. Inside that room, strangers would decide her fate. A judge she'd never met would determine whether she stayed with Grandma Dorothy in the little yellow house with the garden and Max's dog bed by the fireplace, or whether she'd be forced to live with a man she didn't know, in a place that wasn't home. "Come on, baby," Dorothy whispered, standing slowly. Her knees creaked, arthritis, she'd told the social worker, but it wasn't that bad. She could still take care of Emma just fine. Emma stood robotically, her hand never leaving Max's harness. Other people filed into the courtroom. Her grandmother's lawyer, Ms. Patricia Chen, who wore red lipstick and had kind eyes. Robert's lawyer, a tall man with slick-back hair and a practiced smile. The social worker, Mrs. Henderson, who'd been assigned to Emma's case and visited their house once a month. The courtroom itself was nothing like the ones on TV. It was smaller, more intimate, with wood paneling that seemed to absorb sound. The judge's bench loomed at the front, empty for now, waiting. Rows of seats, the gallery Ms. Chen had called them, lined either side. A court reporter sat at a small desk, her fingers poised over a strange machine. Dorothy led Emma to a seat in the front row, right behind where Ms. Chen would sit. Max settled at Emma's feet, his bulk a comforting presence. The little girl stared at her shoes, pink sneakers with Velcro straps because she still couldn't manage laces. Her mother had been teaching her to tie them that last week before the accident. They'd never finished the lesson. "All rise." The bailiff's voice made Emma jump. Everyone stood as Judge Margaret Harrison entered through a side door. She was a black woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an expression that gave nothing away. Her black robe swished as she took her seat. "Please be seated." Emma sat, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Max's head came up, resting on her knee, his brown eyes locked on her face. In his gaze, she saw what she always saw: unconditional love, unwavering loyalty, the promise that no matter what happened in this room, she wouldn't face it alone. The judge shuffled papers, reading something Emma couldn't see. Then Judge Harrison looked up, her eyes sweeping the courtroom before landing on Emma herself. For a long moment, their gazes held. And Emma thought she saw something there, something that looked almost like understanding. "Let's begin," Judge Harrison said, her voice firm but not unkind. "This is a custody hearing for the minor child Emma Catherine Carter, age 7. The court has reviewed all submitted materials. We'll now hear testimony to determine what placement is in this child's best interest." Emma's hand found Max's fur again, gripping tight. Her fate was about to be decided. Robert Carter straightened his tie for the third time in 10 minutes, his fingers fumbling with the silk knot. The navy fabric felt like a noose around his neck, tight and suffocating, but his lawyer had insisted. "Look respectable, look remorseful, look like a father." He'd practiced the expression in the courthouse bathroom mirror that morning, eyes slightly downcast, a hint of sadness mixed with hope, the look of a man who'd lost his way but found redemption. The fluorescent lights had been harsh, showing every line the last decade had carved into his face. 42 years old and he looked 50. That's what alcohol and bad choices did to a man. But 18 months sober now. 18 months of AA meetings in church basements, of bitter coffee and strangers sharing their rock-bottom stories. 18 months of his sponsor, Mike, calling him every morning at 6 a.m. to make sure he was awake and hadn't fallen off the wagon. 18 months of pretending he was doing it for the right reasons. The truth Robert couldn't say out loud, especially not here, was that he'd barely thought about Emma during those dark years. His daughter had been an abstraction, a responsibility he'd fled from when she was 3, and his marriage was crumbling. He'd told himself Sarah, his ex-wife, was better off without him, that Emma deserved better than a father who couldn't stay sober for more than 3 weeks at a time. Then Sarah had died in that accident, and suddenly there was a settlement. A big one. The drunk driver's insurance company had paid out nearly $500,000, held in trust for Emma until she turned 18, or until her legal guardian gained access for her care and expenses. Robert's lawyer, David Thornton, slid into the seat beside him, bringing the scent of expensive cologne. "Remember what we talked about," David murmured, his voice low. "You're a changed man. You've done the work. You want a relationship with your daughter. Emphasize the father-child bond, the importance of paternal connection." "Got it," Robert whispered back, trying to ignore the guilt gnawing at his stomach. He'd been shocked when David had told him he actually had a case. "The grandmother is elderly," the lawyer had explained during their first meeting. "Limited income, no legal obligation to raise the child. You're the biological father, you've completed rehab, you have stable employment. Family court favors reunification. We can win this." "Win?" like Emma was a prize to be claimed rather than a traumatized child he'd abandoned. Robert's eyes drifted across the courtroom to where his daughter sat, pressed against Dorothy like she was trying to disappear into the old woman's side. That damn dog took up half the space, some kind of service animal the grandmother had gotten. Emma's hand was buried in its fur, her knuckles white from gripping so hard. She looked so much like Sarah. The same delicate features, the same dark curls, the same wide eyes, though Emma's were empty in a way Sarah's never had been. Even from across the room, Robert could see his daughter wasn't really present. She was looking through him, through everyone, like she existed in some other dimension where none of this could touch her. A flicker of genuine remorse passed through him. He'd heard about the accident from his brother 6 months after it happened. Sarah's car had been T-boned by a drunk driver running a red light. She died instantly. Emma had been in the back seat, physically unharmed but broken in ways that didn't show up on X-rays. His brother had said Emma hadn't spoken since that night. Not a word, not even a scream. Robert had been in his 3rd stint in rehab when he'd gotten the news. He'd cried then, real tears for the woman he'd once loved and the daughter he'd abandoned. But he'd told himself it was too late, that showing up would only make things worse. Dorothy was handling it. Emma didn't need him. Then his brother had mentioned the settlement money in passing, and something had shifted in Robert's mind. A door opening, an opportunity. Mike, his sponsor, had been the one to suggest he reach out. Make amends, Mike had said. That's step 9, Robert. Make amends to those you've harmed. Your daughter needs her father. Robert had latched onto that, letting himself believe it was about redemption rather than money. He'd started the legal process 6 months ago, gathering documentation of his sobriety, his employment at the warehouse, his clean apartment. He'd taken parenting classes specifically for children with special needs. He'd done everything right. But he'd felt Emma's fear during that supervised visit, the way she'd trembled when he tried to get close. The way that dog had positioned itself between them, protective and alert. Dorothy had watched him with unconcealed hatred, her arms wrapped around Emma like she could shield her granddaughter from the world. All rise. The command snapped Robert back to the present. Everyone stood as the judge entered, a stern-looking black woman whose reputation for being tough but fair had actually given David confidence. She follows the law, his lawyer had said, and the law is on our side. Judge Margaret Harrison took her seat with the kind of authority that comes from years on the bench. Her eyes swept the courtroom, lingering for a moment on Emma before moving to the lawyers. "Please be seated," she said, her voice carrying easily through the room. "This is a custody hearing for the minor child Emma Catherine Carter, age 7. The court has reviewed all submitted materials. We'll now hear testimony to determine what placement is in this child's best interest." David stood smoothly. "Your Honor, the petitioner, Robert Carter, requests custody of his biological daughter. Mr. Carter has completed substance abuse treatment, maintained sobriety for 18 months, secured stable employment, and completed court-ordered parenting classes. He's prepared to provide a home for his daughter and rebuild their relationship." Robert forced himself to sit up straighter, to look like the reformed man he was supposed to be. He could feel Dorothy's glare burning into the back of his head. Judge Harrison made a note on her papers. "I see," and the respondent. Patricia Chen stood, her red lipstick bright against her serious expression. "Your Honor, Dorothy Carter has provided stable, loving care for Emma since her daughter's death. Emma has severe trauma-related conditions and is nonverbal. She requires specialized care, which Mrs. Carter has consistently provided. Removing her from this environment would be devastating to her recovery." The judge nodded slowly. "Mr. Thornton, call your first witness." The petitioner calls Robert Carter to the stand. This was it. Robert stood on shaking legs, aware that every eye in the courtroom was on him. He walked to the witness stand, placed his hand on the Bible the bailiff offered, and swore to tell the truth. The whole truth. Nothing but the truth. He swallowed hard, trying not to think about all the lies he'd told himself to get to this moment, and sat down to perform the role of his life, the repentant father who deserved a second chance. Even if that father was mostly a fiction. Even if the little girl watching him with vacant eyes knew, somehow, that he was dangerous in ways the court couldn't measure. Dorothy Carter's hands trembled in her lap as she watched Robert take the witness stand. Each step he took felt like a nail being driven into her heart. How dare he? How dare he walk in here after all these years, looking clean and sober and respectable, acting like he had any right to Emma? She dug her fingernails into her palms, the sharp pain keeping her grounded, keeping her from standing up and screaming at the judge that this was wrong, all wrong. Patricia Chen, her lawyer, had warned her, "Stay calm. Show the court you're stable. Any outburst will hurt our case." But God, it was hard to stay calm when everything she loved was about to be ripped away. Robert settled into the witness chair, his lawyer approaching with the confident stride of a man who thought he'd already won. Dorothy studied her former son-in-law's face, searching for any trace of the charming young man Sarah had fallen in love with 17 years ago. That Robert had been funny, charismatic, full of big dreams about the business he'd start, the life they'd build. This Robert was a stranger, wearing a familiar face. "Mr. Carter," David Thornton began, his voice smooth as oil, "can you tell the court about your relationship with your daughter?" Dorothy's jaw clenched. What relationship? The man had sent exactly 3 birthday cards in 4 years, all of them late. Robert leaned forward and Dorothy had to admit he looked sincere. "I love Emma more than anything," he said, his voice catching slightly. "I know I made terrible mistakes. I wasn't there when she needed me, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I've changed. I've worked hard to become the father she deserves." Liar, Dorothy thought viciously. She glanced at Emma, sitting rigid beside her. The little girl was staring at nothing, her fingers twisted so tightly in Max's fur that Dorothy worried she'd hurt herself. The dog sat perfectly still, absorbing Emma's distress like a furry lightning rod. "Can you describe the work you've done to address your substance abuse issues?" Thornton asked. "I completed a 90-day inpatient program at Serenity Hills," Robert recited, like he'd practiced this 100 times, probably had. "After that, I attended outpatient therapy 3 times a week for 6 months. I've been going to AA meetings daily for 18 months. I have a sponsor, Mike Rodriguez, who's here today if the court wants to hear from him. I've been sober for 18 months and 14 days. Dorothy wanted to slow clap. 18 months. Her daughter had been dead for 2 years, and he'd only gotten sober 6 months after she died. Where was his sobriety when Sarah was alive and struggling? Where was his redemption when Emma was a toddler, watching her father choose bottles over bedtime stories? "And your employment," Thornton continued. "I work full-time at Morrison Warehouse and Distribution. I'm a shift supervisor now. Good benefits, stable income. I've rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood with good schools. I've already enrolled Emma in Pinewood Elementary. They have excellent special education resources." He'd done his homework. Dorothy had to give him that. It all sounded so perfect, so thought out. But it was a house of cards built on sand. She knew it. She felt it in her bones. "Have you taken steps to educate yourself about Emma's condition?" "Yes, sir. I've completed a 12-week course on parenting children with trauma. I've met with child psychologists to understand what Emma needs. I've researched service dogs and how to work with them. I've read everything I could find about selective mutism and PTSD in children." Dorothy's stomach turned. He talked about Emma's trauma like it was a subject to study, a problem to solve with the right research. He had no idea what it was actually like. The nights Emma woke up screaming without sound, her mouth open in a silent scream that was somehow more terrifying than any noise. The days when Emma wouldn't eat, wouldn't move, just sat staring at nothing while Dorothy begged her to come back. The first 6 months after Sarah's death had been hell. Emma had regressed completely, becoming almost catatonic. Dorothy had been 66 years old, suddenly responsible for a severely traumatized 5-year-old, drowning in grief herself while trying to keep Emma afloat. She'd sold Sarah's jewelry, the good pieces, the ones that had been in the family for generations. She'd taken out a second mortgage on her house. She'd spent every penny she had and then some to get Emma the help she needed. Therapists, specialists, medications that didn't work, medications that worked a little, finally the suggestion that a service dog might help. Max had cost $25,000. Dorothy had thought her heart would stop when she'd seen the price, but she'd found a way. She always found a way. And it had worked. Slowly, painfully slowly, Max had brought Emma back from the edge. The dog seemed to understand things no human could. He knew when Emma was about to have a panic attack before she did. He could sense her nightmares and would wake her gently, grounding her before the terror took hold. He was the bridge between Emma and the world, the only thing that made life bearable for her. "Mr. Carter," Judge Harrison interrupted, and Dorothy's attention snapped back to the present. "Emma hasn't lived with you since she was 3 years old. That's 4 years. She doesn't know you." Robert nodded, looking appropriately humble. "I understand that, Your Honor. It's one of my deepest regrets. But children are resilient and I'm willing to take it slow. I'm not asking to tear her away immediately. I'm willing to do a gradual transition, whatever's best for Emma." A gradual transition, like Emma was a houseplant being moved to a different window. Patricia Chen stood for cross-examination, and Dorothy felt a flicker of hope. Patricia was good. She'd promised Dorothy she'd fight. "Mr. Carter, when exactly did you learn about your daughter's condition?" Patricia asked, her tone sharp. About 8 months ago." 8 months ago? And when did your ex-wife die?" 2 years ago." Robert's confidence faltered slightly. "So for over a year, you knew your daughter had lost her mother, and you did nothing." I was in rehab. I didn't think." "You didn't think," Patricia repeated. "And in the 4 years before that, how many times did you see Emma?" Robert shifted in his seat. Not as often as I should have." "How many times, Mr. Carter?" "Maybe 5 or 6 times." 5 or 6 times in 4 years. And how much child support did you pay during that time?" The silence was damning. "I was struggling financially." "But you could afford alcohol." Patricia's voice cut like a knife. "You could afford your addiction, but you couldn't afford $50 a month for your daughter." Dorothy watched Robert's face redden. Good. Let the judge see what he really was. "Mr. Carter, isn't it true that Emma's mother left a substantial settlement from the accident? Nearly $500,000 held in trust." Thornton shot to his feet. "Objection. The settlement is irrelevant to Mr. Carter's fitness as a parent." "It's relevant to his motivation," Patricia countered. Judge Harrison considered. "I'll allow it. Mr. Carter, please answer." Robert's jaw worked. "Yes, there's a settlement, but that's not why. As Emma's legal guardian, you would have access to those funds for her care, correct?" Yes, but..." "No further questions." Patricia sat down and Dorothy wanted to hug her, but her relief was short-lived. The judge's face remained impassive, unreadable. Robert stepped down from the witness stand and Dorothy's chest tightened with panic. She was next. In a few minutes, she'd have to take that stand and convince the judge that an elderly woman with arthritis and a small pension was better for Emma than a biological father who looked like he'd turned his life around. She'd have to find the words to explain what couldn't be explained, that love wasn't about biology or money or second chances. It was about the 2 years of midnight terrors and speech therapy, and slowly, painfully, teaching a broken child how to feel safe again. It was about Max's head on Emma's lap right now, the only thing keeping that little girl from shattering completely. Patricia leaned over and squeezed her hand. "You've got this," she whispered. But as Dorothy stood on shaking legs and walked toward the witness stand, she wasn't sure she had anything at all except a desperate, aching love for a child she'd do anything to protect. Even if the law said that wasn't enough, Dr. Sarah Mitchell gathered her notes with steady hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs. In 15 years of practicing child psychology, she'd testified in court dozens of times. But this case was different. Emma Carter wasn't just a case file to her, she was a miracle in progress, a child who'd clawed her way back from the brink of complete psychological collapse. And now these people wanted to undo everything. "Please state your name and credentials for the record," Patricia Chen said gently. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in childhood trauma and PTSD. I have a PhD from Emory University, and I've been treating Emma Carter for the past 22 months. Sarah's eyes found Emma in the gallery. The little girl sat frozen, her face pale as moonlight, Max pressed against her legs like a living shield. Even from the witness stand, Sarah could see the shallow, rapid breathing that signaled Emma was approaching her limit. They needed to move this along before the child had a full panic attack in open court. "Dr. Mitchell, can you describe Emma's condition when you first met her?" Patricia asked. Sarah took a breath, remembering that first session. Emma was 5 years old, approximately 4 months post-accident. She'd been referred by her pediatrician due to complete mutism, failure to thrive, and what her grandmother described as not being present. "When I met Emma, she was essentially catatonic." "Can you elaborate?" "She wouldn't make eye contact, wouldn't respond to her name. She'd stopped eating voluntarily, her grandmother had to coax every bite into her. She wasn't sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours a night. She'd lost 8 pounds from an already small frame. Most concerning, she showed no emotional response to anything. Not tears, not smiles, nothing. It was as if the Emma who existed before the accident had simply vanished." Judge Harrison leaned forward. "What was your diagnosis?" "Severe post-traumatic stress disorder with dissociative features and selective mutism secondary to trauma. Emma witnessed her mother's death in violent, horrific circumstances. The human mind, especially a child's mind, sometimes protects itself by shutting down completely. Emma had essentially locked herself away where the trauma couldn't reach her." "What was her prognosis?" the judge asked. This was the hard part. Sarah chose her words carefully. "Guarded. Children who experience this level of trauma and dissociation, some of them never fully recover. Some remain partially detached from reality for years, even decades. I told Mrs. Carter that we'd try everything, but I couldn't promise Emma would ever speak again. I couldn't promise she'd ever really come back." Dorothy's quiet sob echoed through the courtroom. Sarah wanted to comfort her but pressed on. "What treatment did you recommend?" Patricia prompted. "Initially, play therapy, art therapy, EMDR. That's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and regular sessions to build trust. But Emma wasn't responding. She'd sit in my office like a doll, staring at nothing. After 6 months, I was running out of options." "What changed?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Max changed everything. I suggested that Mrs. Carter look into psychiatric service dogs. I'd seen some remarkable results with trauma patients, particularly children. The unconditional presence of an animal can sometimes reach places human connection can't." She glanced at the golden retriever in the gallery. Max was trained specifically for Emma's needs. He cost a fortune. Mrs. Carter mortgaged her house to afford him. But within 2 weeks of Max entering Emma's life, we saw the first real breakthrough. "What happened?" Emma smiled. It was brief, barely there, but she smiled when Max licked her face. Then she started touching him voluntarily, seeking him out. Within a month, she was sleeping through the night with Max beside her. Within 3 months, she was eating normally again. After 6 months, she was making eye contact, engaging with the world. Max became her interpreter, her safety, her bridge back to the living. Patricia nodded, and her current status. Emma has made remarkable progress. She's not where we'd like her to be. She still doesn't speak, still struggles with anxiety and nightmares, but she's functional. She attends school. She has friends she communicates with through sign language and gestures. She experiences joy, which she didn't for that first terrible year. She's healing, slowly but surely. In your professional opinion, what would happen if Emma were removed from her grandmother's care and placed with her father? David Thornton stood. Objection calls for speculation. Your Honor, Dr. Mitchell is an expert witness qualified to provide professional opinions, Patricia countered. I'll allow it. Dr. Mitchell, you may answer. Sarah looked directly at Judge Harrison, willing her to understand. Your Honor, it would be catastrophic. Emma's sense of safety is built on 3 pillars: her grandmother, Max, and the familiar environment where she's learned to feel secure. Remove any one of those pillars and the entire structure collapses. But children adjust to new environments, the judge said carefully. Typical children, yes. Traumatized children. It's far more complicated. Sarah's voice grew urgent. Think of Emma's psyche as a bone that was shattered and is now healing. It's still fragile, still vulnerable. The wrong pressure applied at the wrong time could re-break it completely. Moving her to live with a virtual stranger, no matter how well-intentioned, would be that wrong pressure. Mr. Carter has completed parenting classes, Thornton interjected. He's educated himself about her condition. Sarah turned to face Robert's lawyer, her professional mask slipping slightly. Reading about trauma and living with a traumatized child are entirely different things. Emma doesn't need someone who's read about PTSD. She needs someone who knows that she can't handle sudden movements, that the smell of gasoline triggers her, that she needs exactly 3 stuffed animals arranged in a specific order to sleep. She needs someone who understands that some days she'll be okay, and some days she'll spend 6 hours sitting in a corner while Max lies beside her. And that's not failure, that's survival. The courtroom was silent. Sarah pressed her advantage. Mrs. Carter knows these things because she's lived them. She knows which nightmares Emma has on Tuesdays versus Thursdays. She knows that Emma will eat scrambled eggs but not fried ones because fried eggs remind her of the hospital breakfast the morning after the accident. She knows that Emma's therapist appointments are sacred, that Max's training requires daily reinforcement, that Emma needs consistency and patience, and someone who won't give up when progress stalls. And you don't believe Mr. Carter can provide that? Judge Harrison asked. Your Honor, Mr. Carter seems sincere. I believe he wants to be a good father, but wanting and being capable are different things. Emma doesn't need good intentions. She needs expertise born from experience. She needs someone who's already weathered her worst moments and didn't abandon her. Thornton shot to his feet. Dr. Mitchell, isn't it true that you're biased because Mrs. Carter is paying for your services? Mrs. Carter pays me $75 per session at a reduced rate because she can't afford my full fee. If I cared about money, I'd prefer Mr. Carter as guardian. He'd likely be able to pay standard rates. But you have a financial interest in maintaining the current arrangement. Sarah's eyes flashed. My interest is in Emma's well-being. If I thought Mr. Carter could provide better care, I'd say so. But he can't. Not now, maybe not ever. And experimenting with a child's mental health to prove a point about parental rights is reckless. Objection, Thornton's face reddened. Sustained, Judge Harrison said quietly. Dr. Mitchell, please limit your responses to facts. The fact is this, Sarah said, her voice dropping but intensifying. If Emma is removed from her grandmother's care, I believe there's a significant risk of regression. She could become mute again. She could stop eating. She could retreat so far inside herself that we might not get her back this time. That's not speculation. That's clinical assessment based on 22 months of intensive treatment. She looked at Emma again, at the small figure trembling in the gallery, and made a decision. Your Honor, if the court orders Emma to live with her father against her will, I'll continue treating her if possible. But I'm obligated to tell you that I'll be treating a re-traumatized child. I'll be starting over from the beginning, trying to repair damage that didn't have to happen. And this time, I can't promise we'll succeed. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Patricia Chen gave her a subtle nod of approval. No further questions. As Sarah stepped down from the witness stand, her legs shaky with spent adrenaline, she caught Dorothy's eye. The older woman mouthed two words, "Thank you." But Sarah knew the truth that civilians often didn't understand. Expert testimony could sway a judge, but it couldn't guarantee anything. The law had its own logic, its own priorities. Biological parents had rights that sometimes superseded what was best for children. She returned to her seat in the gallery and watched as the legal machinery ground forward, hoping desperately that her warning had been enough. That someone would listen before it was too late. Judge Margaret Harrison removed her reading glasses and pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to ease the headache building behind her eyes. 20 years on the family court bench, thousands of cases, and this one was tearing her apart in ways she hadn't expected. The law was clear. She'd studied it, lived it, breathed it for 2 decades. Biological parents had rights, fundamental constitutional rights. The state couldn't simply take children away because someone else might raise them better. That wasn't how the system worked. That wasn't how America worked. Robert Carter had done everything asked of him, completed rehab, maintained sobriety for 18 months, verified by drug tests and his sponsor's testimony, secured stable employment with benefits, finished parenting classes, rented an appropriate home. He'd even educated himself about Emma's condition, demonstrating genuine effort to understand her needs. On paper, he deserved a second chance. But Margaret hadn't survived 2 decades in family court by relying solely on paper. She looked at the man sitting beside his lawyer, studying his face with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every type of parent imaginable. Robert Carter looked the part, clean-cut, remorseful, earnest. But there was something in his eyes, a calculation she couldn't quite name. She'd seen it before in parents who fought for custody for the wrong reasons. Insurance settlements, social security benefits, tax advantages, spite against an ex-spouse. Margaret had learned to trust her instincts about these things. Then there was Dorothy Carter, 68 years old, living on a modest pension and Social Security, arthritis in her knees, no legal obligation to raise her granddaughter. By strict legal standards, she was the weaker candidate, elderly, limited resources, no biological claim. But that woman had mortgaged her house to buy a service dog. She knew which nightmares her granddaughter had on which days. She'd spent 2 years pulling a traumatized child back from the edge of complete psychological collapse. Margaret had 3 children of her own, all grown now. She remembered the exhaustion of raising them, the constant vigilance, the way motherhood aged you in ways that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with worry. Dorothy Carter had already raised 1 daughter. Now she was raising another child during what should have been her retirement years. She was doing it out of love, pure, uncomplicated love. Could the same be said for Robert Carter? Margaret shuffled through the documents again. Dr. Mitchell's testimony had been damning, not in what she'd said about Robert, but in what she'd said about Emma. The fragility of the child's recovery, the specificity of her needs, the catastrophic risk of disruption. But judges couldn't make decisions based solely on emotion or therapeutic recommendations. There were legal standards, precedents, rights that needed protecting. The 14th Amendment guaranteed parents' rights to raise their children. Case after case had established that biological parents deserved deference unless they were demonstrably unfit. Was Robert Carter unfit? Legally speaking, probably not. He'd addressed his addiction. He had no criminal record. He'd never been violent or abusive. His only crime was absence, terrible, unforgivable absence, but absence nonetheless. Margaret looked at her own notes from the hearing. She'd written, "Father's rights versus child's needs, precedent versus compassion, letter of law versus spirit of law." Then she'd underlined one question: what serves Emma's best interest? Best interest of the child. That was the standard in custody cases, but best interest could be interpreted in different ways. Stability versus biological connection, current safety versus long-term rights, the known versus the potential. Margaret's clerk had placed Emma's school records and therapy reports on top of the pile. She opened them again, reading between the lines. Emma had gone from being completely catatonic to functioning in a special education classroom. She had friends. She was learning. She was healing. All of that progress had happened under Dorothy's care. What would happen under Robert's care? He seemed willing, even eager, but Dr. Mitchell's warning echoed in Margaret's mind. Wanting and being capable are different things. The courtroom had fallen into an anxious silence. Both lawyers had presented their closing arguments. Patricia Chen had been passionate, emphasizing Emma's vulnerability and the irreplaceable bond with her grandmother. David Thornton had been measured and logical, emphasizing Robert's rights and his demonstrated commitment to change. Now it was Margaret's turn to decide. She could order a gradual transition, supervised visits leading to shared custody, and eventually full custody for Robert. It was the legally defensible path, the one that respected parental rights while appearing to protect the child's interests. But her gut told her it was wrong. She could award full custody to Dorothy, terminating Robert's parental rights or limiting him to supervised visitation. It would protect Emma in the short term but might not hold up on appeal. Robert's lawyer would argue she'd ignored his constitutional rights without sufficient legal justification. Margaret felt trapped between what the law required and what her conscience demanded. Then she looked up, directly at Emma Carter in the gallery, and everything shifted. The little girl wasn't crying or causing a scene. She was simply disappearing. Margaret had seen it before in severely traumatized children, that quality of becoming less substantial, as if they were fatting from the physical world into somewhere safer inside themselves. Emma's hand was buried in her service dog's fur, gripping so hard her knuckles were white. The dog, Max, they'd said his name was, sat perfectly still, absorbing the child's distress with the patient dignity of a creature that understood its purpose. And suddenly, Margaret realized something crucial. She was deciding this child's fate without ever really seeing her. Emma had been present throughout the hearing, but she'd been treated like a piece of evidence rather than a person. They'd all talked about her, testified about her, argued over her. But no one had asked Emma what she wanted. Of course, Emma couldn't speak. Dr. Mitchell had been clear about that, but Margaret had learned over 20 years that communication took many forms: body language, behavior, choice of where to sit and who to cling to. Emma had chosen. She'd been choosing throughout this entire hearing, pressed against her grandmother, holding onto her dog, never once looking toward Robert Carter. But was that enough? Could Margaret justify a custody decision based on a non-verbal 7-year-old's apparent preferences? The law said no. Children Emma's age weren't considered capable of making custody decisions. Their wishes could be considered but weren't determinative. Yet Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's silence was itself a form of testimony, the most important testimony this courtroom would hear. An idea formed in Margaret's mind, unconventional, possibly irregular. But this entire case was irregular, and sometimes irregular cases required irregular approaches. She made her decision. "I'd like Emma to approach the bench," Margaret heard herself say. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Dorothy looked terrified. Patricia Chen's eyes widened. Robert's lawyer stood halfway as if to object, then sat back down uncertainly. Margaret raised her hand for silence. "I'm not asking her to testify. I'm not asking her to choose. I just want to see her. I want to look at this child whose future I'm deciding." It wasn't standard procedure. It might not even be proper procedure. But Margaret had learned that justice sometimes required breaking from procedure, especially when the people involved were already broken. "Bailiff, please help the child come forward," Margaret said quietly. She watched as Emma stood on shaking legs, the service dog immediately rising beside her. Dorothy looked like she might object, might pull Emma back, but Patricia Chen put a gentle hand on her arm. Emma walked down the aisle with agonizing slowness, each step looking like it cost her something precious. Max stayed glued to her side, his body pressed against her hip. As they approached the bench, Margaret's heart broke a little. This child was so small, so fragile, so clearly terrified. And in that moment, looking at Emma Carter's pale, frightened face, Judge Margaret Harrison realized that sometimes the right decision and the legal decision weren't the same thing. Sometimes you had to choose. Emma's legs felt like they were made of water, trembling so badly she thought she might collapse right there in the middle of the aisle. Every eye in the courtroom was on her. She could feel their stares like physical touches, pressing against her skin, making her want to crawl out of her own body and disappear. Max walked beside her, his shoulder pressed firmly against her hip in the way he'd been trained. Pressure, grounding, "You're here, you're safe, I'm with you." His warmth was the only real thing in a world that had suddenly become too bright, too loud, too terrifyingly present. One step, another, the distance to the judge's bench felt infinite. Emma's heart hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears, a frantic drumbeat drowning out everything else. The familiar tightness was building in her chest, the one that came before the darkness, before the place where she went when the world became too much. She could feel herself starting to slip away, starting to retreat into that safe, numb space where nothing could hurt her. But Max nudged her hand with his nose, firm and insistent. Stay here, stay with me." Judge Harrison was standing now, something Emma had never seen a judge do in the court TV shows Grandma Dorothy sometimes watched. The judge's face was different than before, softer somehow, sad in a way that made Emma's chest hurt even more. "Hello, Emma," the judge said, her voice gentle like she was talking to something wild and frightened, which Emma supposed she was. "I know this is scary. I'm very sorry you have to be here in this place with all these people." Emma couldn't respond. The words were locked inside her throat, trapped behind the wall that had built itself the night everything shattered. She tried to speak so many times in the past 2 years, tried to call for her mother in the hospital, tried to tell Grandma Dorothy about the nightmares, tried to answer Dr. Mitchell's careful questions. But the words never came. They died with her mother on that rain-slicked highway. "I'm trying to make the best decision for you," Judge Harrison continued. "I'm trying to understand what you need, what will make you safe and happy." Safe, the word echoed in Emma's mind. Where was safe? Safe was Grandma Dorothy's house with the yellow walls and the garden where butterflies came in summer. Safe was Max's dog bed beside her own bed, so she could reach down in the night and touch his fur. Safe was Dr. Mitchell's office with the soft pillows and the art supplies. Safe was knowing what would happen next, knowing the routine, knowing she wouldn't be abandoned. Safe was not going with the man who sat across the courtroom, the stranger with her dead father's face. "If you could tell me anything," the judge said, leaning forward slightly, "what would you want me to know?" Emma's breath came in short, sharp gasps. The pressure in her chest was building, like a balloon being inflated past its limit. Her vision started to narrow at the edges, the warning sign that she was about to disappear, about to lose herself completely. No, she couldn't let that happen. Not now, not when it mattered most. Dr. Mitchell's voice echoed in her memory from their last session. "Emma, you're stronger than you think. You've survived the worst thing imaginable. You can do hard things." Max pressed harder against her leg and something broke loose inside Emma's chest. Not words. She still couldn't find words, but something else. Something deeper. Her hand moved without her consciously deciding to move it. It rose to her chest, her small palm pressing flat against her heart. She could feel it beating, wild and desperate, proof that she was alive even when she wanted to be anywhere but here. "My heart," the gesture said, "this is where I feel things." Then her hand moved to Max, her fingers sinking into his thick golden fur. The dog stood perfectly still, patient as stone, letting her use him as an anchor. "My dog," the gesture continued, "this is what keeps me here. This is what saved me." For a moment, Emma paused. The courtroom was absolutely silent, so quiet she could hear someone's watch ticking, could hear the air conditioning's soft hum, could hear her own ragged breathing. Then, with every ounce of courage she possessed, Emma lifted her hand one more time and pointed. Not vaguely, not uncertainly, but with absolute clarity. She pointed directly at Grandma Dorothy, sitting in the front row with tears streaming down her wrinkled face. The gesture screamed without sound. "She is my home, she is my safety, she is everything." The courtroom gasped collectively, a sharp intake of breath from dozens of people simultaneously. But Max understood what Emma needed before even she did. The dog had been trained for this, for moments when Emma couldn't express herself, when her body needed to do what her voice couldn't. He walked 3 deliberate steps toward Dorothy and sat down, facing Emma, his brown eyes locked on hers. "Come here," his posture said. "This is where you belong. This is the path to safety." Emma's hand went to her heart again, trembling. Then to Max. Then she pointed at her grandmother once more insistent this time, her whole arm extended, her finger steady despite the shaking of her body. "Heart, dog, grandmother. Love, safety, home." The message was crystal clear to anyone willing to see it. Judge Harrison's hand flew to her mouth. The hard-faced woman who'd presided over thousands of cases looked like she'd been struck by lightning. "Did everyone see that?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Did everyone just witness that?" Emma repeated the gesture, desperately now. She needed them to understand. She couldn't use words, but she could use this, her body, her dog, her truth. "Heart, dog, grandmother. Please, please understand." Max walked back to Emma, then returned to Dorothy again, demonstrating the path, showing the judge and the lawyers and everyone in the courtroom exactly where Emma felt safe, where she needed to be. "Your Honor," Robert's lawyer started to speak, but Judge Harrison cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. "I said nobody move." The judge's voice rang out with absolute authority. "This child is communicating. This child is testifying." Emma's legs finally gave out. She sank to her knees on the courtroom floor, her arms wrapping around Max's neck, and for the first time since entering this terrible room, she felt like maybe, just maybe, someone had actually heard her. Max licked her face gently, tasting her tears, and pressed his weight against her shaking body. "Good girl," his presence seemed to say. "You did it. You told them." Judge Harrison called to the back of the courtroom. "Dr. Mitchell, come to the bench, now." Emma heard Dr. Mitchell's footsteps approaching, felt her therapist's presence beside her. "Is this communication?" the judge asked urgently. "Is this Emma expressing a preference?" "Your Honor," Dr. Mitchell's voice was thick with emotion. "This is the most intentional, most clear communication Emma has made in 2 years. She's telling you, in the only language she has, exactly what she needs." Emma kept her face buried in Max's fur, but she heard everything. She heard the judge's sharp intake of breath. She heard her grandmother's quiet sobs. She heard the rustling of papers, the whispers spreading through the gallery. And for the first time in 2 years of silence, Emma felt like her voice had finally been heard. Judge Margaret Harrison rose from her bench completely, something she'd done perhaps 3 times in her entire 20-year career. The gavel that typically served as her voice of authority lay forgotten on its wooden block. She needed no gavel now. Her presence alone commanded absolute attention. "Nobody move," she repeated, her voice lower but somehow more powerful. Not one person in this courtroom moves until I say so. The bailiff froze mid-step. Robert's lawyer, David Thornton, who'd been rising to object, remained suspended in an awkward half-standing position. The court reporter's fingers hovered motionless above her machine. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. Emma remained on her knees, arms wrapped around Max's neck, her small body shaking with the effort of what she'd just done. Dr. Mitchell knelt beside her, one hand gently resting on the child's shoulder, tears streaming openly down her face. Margaret descended from her bench. Another breach of protocol, but protocol be damned. She'd spent 2 decades following rules, and sometimes rules needed to break for justice to happen. She approached Emma slowly, carefully, the way you'd approach a wounded bird. "Emma," she said softly, kneeling down so she was at the child's eye level. "Sweetheart, I need you to look at me if you can." Emma's face emerged slowly from Max's fur, her eyes red and swollen, her cheeks streaked with tears. But there was something different in those eyes now, not the vacant, hollow look that had haunted them throughout the hearing. There was presence. There was determination. There was a person fighting to be seen. "Can you do that again for me?" Judge Harrison asked gently. "Can you show me one more time what you were trying to say?" For a moment, Emma just stared at her, exhausted and terrified. The effort of breaking through her silence had cost her something enormous. Margaret could see it in the trembling of her small frame, in the way she gripped Max's vest like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. But then Emma nodded, just once, a tiny movement but deliberate. Her hand rose to her heart again, pressing flat against her chest. The gesture was slower this time, more controlled. She held it there for a 3 count, making sure everyone saw, everyone understood. Then her hand moved to Max, fingers spreading through his golden fur, demonstrating the connection between them, the lifeline that had pulled her back from the abyss. Finally, with her eyes locked on Judge Harrison's face, Emma pointed. Her arm extended fully toward Dorothy Carter, steady and sure. The message was unmistakable. "This is where my heart is safe. This is where I belong." Max stood and walked to Dorothy again, his training kicking in, reinforcing Emma's communication. He sat at Dorothy's feet and looked back at Emma, then at the judge as if to say, "See, this is what she's been trying to tell you all along." The courtroom erupted in whispers, gasps, a few stifled sobs. Margaret held up her hand for silence and got it instantly. "Dr. Mitchell," the judge said, her voice steady despite the emotion churning inside her, "in your professional opinion, what just happened here?" Sarah Mitchell wiped her eyes and stood, her voice clear and strong. "Your Honor, what you just witnessed is a breakthrough. Emma has been unable to express herself verbally since her mother's death. We've been working on alternative communication methods, sign language, picture cards, written words, but she's resisted them all. This spontaneous, self-directed communication is extraordinary. She's telling us, in the only language she can access right now, exactly what she needs. And what is she telling us? That she feels safe with her grandmother, that Max is essential to her survival, that the 3 of them are a unit, heart, dog, family. Separating them would be, in her mind, another death, another traumatic loss she doesn't believe she can survive." Margaret nodded slowly, processing. She looked back at Emma, still kneeling on the courtroom floor, still holding onto Max like he was made of hope and golden light. Then she looked at Robert Carter. The man had gone pale. His confident demeanor had cracked, revealing something underneath, not quite guilt, but not innocence either. He was staring at his daughter with an expression that might have been shock or might have been calculation. Margaret couldn't quite read it, and that uncertainty told her everything she needed to know. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, her voice sharp now, cutting, "did you see what your daughter just did?" Robert opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Yes, Your Honor." "Your daughter, who hasn't communicated meaningfully in 2 years, just found a way to tell this court exactly what she needs. What do you think about that? For a moment, something flickered across Robert's face, maybe remorse, maybe recognition of defeat. Then his lawyer whispered something urgent in his ear, and his expression hardened. "Your Honor, children don't always know what's best for them," Robert said, his voice strained. "That's why adults make these decisions. I'm her father. I have rights." "Rights?" Margaret interrupted, her voice like ice. "Yes, you have rights, Mr. Carter. Constitutional rights. Legal rights. The courts have affirmed parental rights again and again, and I respect that precedent. I have to respect it." Dorothy's face crumpled with despair. Patricia Chen closed her eyes, knowing what was coming. A ruling in Robert's favor despite everything, because the law was the law. But then Judge Harrison did something unexpected. She turned back to Emma, still kneeling on the floor, and smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "But your daughter also has rights, Mr. Carter. She has the right to be heard, even without words. She has the right to safety, to stability, to healing. And she just exercised those rights in the most powerful way imaginable." Margaret stood, brushing off her robes, and addressed the entire courtroom. "I've been a judge for 20 years. I've seen thousands of children come through these doors. Some of them testify verbally. Some of them don't. But I've learned that children communicate in many ways, through their behavior, their choices, their bodies, their bonds. Emma Carter just communicated more clearly than 90% of the verbal witnesses I've heard in this courtroom." She paused, letting the words sink in. "That child didn't just point at her grandmother. She showed us her heart. She showed us what keeps her alive. She showed us where safety lives for her. And she did it with a courage and clarity that should humble every adult in this room." Patricia Chen was crying openly now. Dorothy had her hands clasped over her mouth, afraid to hope, afraid to believe. "Mr. Carter," the judge continued, "you said children don't always know what's best for them. You're right. But traumatized children know what safety feels like. They know it in their bones, in their blood, in their nightmares. And Emma just told us with absolute certainty where she feels safe." Robert's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, with all respect, this is highly irregular." "Irregular?" Margaret's eyebrows rose. "What's irregular is a father abandoning his family for 4 years, then reappearing after a settlement comes through. What's irregular is a man who can tell this court Emma's diagnosis, but can't tell me her favorite color or what makes her smile. What's irregular is asking a traumatized child to trust a stranger with her survival." The judge's voice softened slightly. "I don't doubt you want to change, Mr. Carter. I even believe you want to be a better person. But wanting and being ready are different things. And your daughter just told us, in the most powerful testimony this court has heard, that she's not ready for you. And frankly, I don't think you're ready for her." Emma watched from the floor, not understanding all the words but understanding the tone, understanding that something fundamental had shifted in the room. Judge Harrison returned to her bench, but she didn't sit. She stood there, looking down at her notes, at the law books that surrounded her, at the symbol of justice hanging on the wall behind her, the blind woman with the scales, weighing truth against precedent. "This court will recess for 30 minutes, she announced. "When we return, I will issue my ruling. Until then, everyone remain in the courthouse." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that made Emma flinch. But Max was there, pressing against her, reminding her that whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. The 30-minute recess felt like 30 hours. Dorothy sat in the hallway with Emma pulled tight against her side. Max sprawled across both their laps. The dog's weight was comforting, real, a reminder that no matter what the judge decided, this moment, right now, was theirs. Patricia Chen paced nearby, her phone pressed to her ear as she consulted with colleagues, searching for precedents, for ammunition, for anything that might help. But even she looked uncertain, her usual confidence shaken. Robert stood at the far end of the hall with his lawyer, arguing in fierce whispers. Dorothy caught fragments: appeal, parental rights, Constitutional grounds. David Thornton looked frustrated, his carefully constructed case unraveling because of a 7-year-old's gesture. Emma's hand never left Max's fur. Her face was buried against Dorothy's shoulder, exhausted from the effort of communicating, from breaking through 2 years of silence to make herself understood. Dorothy pressed her lips to Emma's hair, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo, memorizing this moment in case it was one of their last together. "Whatever happens," Dorothy whispered, "I love you more than all the stars in the sky. You hear me? You're the bravest girl I've ever known." Emma's fingers tightened in Max's coat. The bailiff emerged from the courtroom. "Court is reconvening. All parties inside, please." Dorothy's heart stuttered. Patricia helped them stand, and they filed back into the courtroom that had become both battlefield and confessional. The air felt different now, charged with possibility, heavy with consequence. Judge Margaret Harrison entered, and something in her face had changed. The stern judicial mask had cracked, revealing the woman underneath. A mother, a grandmother herself, someone who understood that the law served people, not the other way around. "Please be seated," she said quietly. The courtroom settled into anxious silence. Emma sat between Dorothy and Patricia, Max at her feet, all of them holding their breath. Judge Harrison opened a leather folder, glanced at her notes, then set them aside. "In 20 years on this bench, I've never had a case affect me quite like this one. I've been awake most of the night, reviewing precedents, consulting with colleagues, wrestling with the law." She paused, her eyes finding Emma. "Because this isn't just about law. It's about a little girl who's already lost too much." Robert leaned forward, hope flickering in his eyes. "Mr. Carter, you've presented compelling evidence of your rehabilitation. You've done everything the system asked of you. By legal standards, you've met the requirements for parenting, and I acknowledge your constitutional rights as Emma's biological father." Dorothy's heart sank. This was it. They were going to lose. "However," the judge continued, her voice strengthening, "the law also requires me to determine what serves the child's best interest. And this morning, Emma Carter communicated more clearly than any expert witness or legal argument could." Judge Harrison's gaze swept the courtroom. "That child showed us her heart. She showed us her lifeline. She showed us where safety lives for her. And I cannot, in good conscience, ignore that testimony simply because it came without words." The air in the courtroom seemed to vibrate. "Therefore, after careful consideration, I am awarding full legal custody of Emma Catherine Carter to her grandmother, Dorothy Marie Carter, effective immediately." Dorothy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Emma's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Furthermore," the judge continued over the eruption of whispers, "I am ordering that Robert Carter's visitation rights be supervised and therapeutic in nature, beginning only when Emma's treatment team determines she is ready. Mr. Carter, you may petition to revisit custody arrangements in no less than 2 years, provided you continue your recovery and participate in family therapy." Robert's face had gone from hopeful to devastated to angry in seconds. His lawyer was already whispering about appeals, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "Mr. Carter, I want you to understand something. Your daughter didn't reject you today because she's being manipulated or because she doesn't know what's best. She rejected you because she knows exactly what she needs to survive. And right now, that's not you. That doesn't mean it never will be. But forcing a relationship before she's ready won't create a bond. It will create more trauma." The judge's voice softened. "If you truly love Emma, prove it by respecting her needs over your wants. Get to know her slowly. Earn her trust. Let her heal. And maybe someday you'll have the relationship you're hopping for, but it has to be on her timeline, not yours." The gavel came down. "Custody is awarded to Mrs. Dorothy Carter. This court is adjourned." The courtroom exploded. Patricia Chen was hugging Dorothy, both women crying. Dr. Mitchell appeared from the gallery, wrapping all three of them, Dorothy, Emma, and Max, in her arms. Even the bailiff was smiling. Emma sat very still, processing what had just happened. She'd won. They'd heard her. She was staying home. Max stood and placed his head in her lap, his tail wagging slowly, and something inside Emma's chest, something that had been locked tight for 2 years, began to crack open. 6 months later, Dorothy was in the kitchen making Emma's favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with cheese, not fried, never fried, when she heard it. A sound she'd dreamed of hearing, prayed for, almost given up hope of ever experiencing again. Max, good boy. The spatula clattered to the floor. Dorothy spun around so fast her hip protested. Emma sat in the backyard garden, visible through the window, with Max sprawled beside her in the morning sunshine. The little girl's hand was stroking his fur, and her lips were moving. Max, good boy, Emma repeated, her voice rusty from disuse but real, so beautifully real. Dorothy ran outside, tears streaming down her face. Emma, baby, did you just... Emma looked up at her grandmother, and a smile, a genuine, radiant smile, spread across her face. Grandma, she whispered, testing the word, tasting it. Grandma, I love you. Dorothy dropped to her knees in the grass, pulling Emma into her arms, sobbing with joy. Max wiggled between them, licking both their faces, his tail creating a small windstorm. I love you too, sweetheart, Dorothy managed through her tears. I love you so much. The words came slowly at first, 1 or 2 a day, then more. Within 3 months, Emma was speaking in short sentences. Within 6 months, she was chatting with classmates, laughing at jokes, telling Dorothy about her day. The nightmares didn't disappear completely, but they became less frequent. The anxiety attacks still happened, but Emma learned to manage them with Max's help and Dr. Mitchell's guidance. She was healing, not returning to who she'd been before the accident, but becoming someone new. Someone stronger, forged in trauma but not broken by it. The courtroom video went viral, as these things do. Someone had recorded it on their phone. The moment when Emma pointed to her grandmother, when Max demonstrated the path to safety, when Judge Harrison stood and declared that even silence could testify. The video was titled, "Service Dog Helps Mute Girl Communicate in Court." It was shared millions of times, sparking conversations about childhood trauma, about animal-assisted therapy, about listening to children in all the ways they speak. Judge Harrison received letters from around the country, praising her decision, thanking her for seeing beyond the law to the humanity underneath. She kept one photo on her desk, a picture from the courtroom, Emma kneeling with Max, her hand extended toward Dorothy. She looked at it whenever she faced a difficult case, reminding herself why she'd become a judge in the first place. To protect those who couldn't protect themselves. To listen to voices that spoke without words. To choose compassion over precedent when justice demanded it. 1 year later, Emma sat in her second-grade classroom, her hand raised high. Max lay under her desk, his vest reading "Service Dog" in bold letters, but the other kids had long since stopped treating him as unusual. He was just part of Emma, like her backpack or her sneakers. "Yes, Emma," her teacher called. "I finished my story," Emma announced proudly. "It's about a girl and her dog who save each other. Would you like to read it to the class?" Emma stood, clutching her paper, and began to read in a clear, strong voice. Once upon a time, there was a girl who forgot how to talk. The world was too scary and too loud, so she stopped using words. But then she got a dog named Max, and Max taught her that sometimes you don't need words to say the most important things. Dorothy, sitting in the back of the classroom for the Parent Appreciation Day, wiped tears from her eyes. Beside her, Dr. Mitchell squeezed her hand. "She's going to be okay," Sarah whispered. "She already is," Dorothy replied, watching her granddaughter read with confidence and joy. That evening, Emma helped Dorothy frame a photograph. the official court photo from that day in Judge Harrison's courtroom. In it, Emma's hand was pressed to her heart, Max sat at attention, and Dorothy watched from the gallery with love and fear written across her face. "Why do you want to keep this, sweetheart?" Dorothy asked gently. "It was such a scary day." Emma studied the photo thoughtfully. "Because," she said slowly, "it's the day I remembered I had a voice. Even when I couldn't talk, Max helped me speak, and you made sure people listened." She placed the frame on her nightstand, right next to a photo of her mother. "Mom would be proud of me, wouldn't she?" Emma asked softly. Dorothy pulled her close. "Oh, baby, she would be so proud. You're the bravest person I know." That night, Emma fell asleep easily, her hand resting on Max's head, her dreams filled with golden fur and sunshine, and the sound of her own voice reading stories. She'd been broken, yes, shattered by trauma and loss. But she'd learned what the judge had known all along, that some breaks do heal. That silence can speak louder than words. That love, whether from a grandmother or a golden-furred guardian angel, can pull you back from the deepest darkness. And sometimes, when you've lost your voice, the most important thing isn't speaking again. It's having someone who hears you anyway. The end.